Toronto, 1876, a tough, tight, fiercely loyal stronghold of the British Empire, a citadel of the Tory party and the Orange Lodge. Here the Evening Telegram was born, an instant success because it reflected that Toronto and defended it. That Toronto was long dead. On October 30th, 1971, the Telegram died too, ending an era of active fighting newspaper competition in Canada. The flag-waving years, the wild, foolish years, the good years. We're going to look at them through the pages of the Telegram and the memories of some of the people who made the paper what it was, beginning with a man who remembers its founder, a strange, crusty old Victorian tub thumper called John Ross Robertson.
Oh, he was a nice old fellow, as long as you didn't cross him up. I remember he pretty mad about something that had happened, and he came up to the composing room. And being a boy, I didn't know exactly what it was all about, but all I could hear, or what I did hear him say was, "You bloody bunch of blacksmiths, you call yourselves printers?"
Was a fearful man in one way, and another way he was a strange, bland sort of fellow in that his servants liked him. He was a great Orangeman. He used to come around on July the 12th, come downstairs on July the 12th in his house at 291 Sherburne, all dressed up in the trappings of the Orange Order in order to march at the head of the parade. He didn't miss one for donkey's years. And his servants would come out and dance around him and chuckle over him and pull tassels this way and that to make sure that everything was right, and then he'd stalk off to work, you see.
Did the paper totally reflect John Ross Robertson?
Totally reflected John Ross Robertson, and also Blackjack Robinson, both J.R.R. He was his editor for 30-odd years. He latterly used to write his editorials on paper bags and send them in from his house on Wellesley Street because he became quite eccentric. And he was then ill with a heart condition and so on and so forth. And he was an eccentric too. They were all eccentrics here. That may have been why the paper finally fell on evil ways. That's the old Telegram I'm speaking about.
Blackjack, he was there when I came as an office boy. I used to bicycle to work at $8 a week, which we thought was pretty good pay in those days. The thing I remember about Blackjack most was his booming voice. When Blackjack dictated his editorials, he would start in his office, and he would walk out of the office and walk along the hall, and this booming voice was still going. And Mary Carr, his secretary, she would just sit there, very patient girl, and she'd be able to take down all the dictation without any trouble at all. And Blackjack would then finally turn around and come back and wind it up inside his office here. That was that. This was quite a stunt. The Telegram was the paper, the number one. And if you wanted a job at the City Hall, if you were an Orangeman, you got it. If you weren't an Orangeman, you didn't. Anyone who wanted to get elected in the Telegram walked into the editor's office, and if he came out smiling, you knew that his name was going to be on the Telegram slate on page 1, and you knew that he was in. This is how strong the Telegram was. The influence was terrific.
My beat was everything north of Sinclair Avenue pretty well. From the kingpin of it was Earl's Court, which was a hotbed of British people. And Blackjack Robinson was editor of the Telegram, and the British Empire was his delight, his flag, so I always got lots of space for the British Imperial Association that was centered in Earl's Court. I knew enough to never miss a meeting. And the Orange Parade was the highlight of the year, and some of us, all of us nearly, who weren't actually covering, we had to go out and count the number of people in the parade.
I have been writing the Orange Parade stories for 40 years on and off, but for the last 20 years, I have been the one man assigned to cover that event. Now, there was a time when the telegram, being recognized as the friend of the Orangeman, would devote 10, 12, 16 pages to news of the Orange Order. In those days, the Orange Parade took perhaps 2.5 hours, 3.5 hours or more to pass a given point. There would be 10,000 men, women, and children on parade. There would be 40, 50, 60 bands. They had possession of that street and let anybody try to break ranks. The younger members particularly would see that the ranks were not broken. You could pass between lodges, but never through the ranks of a lodge. That was forbidden. And just try it and see what happened.
Now, is it true, Wilson, that a mayor of Toronto, up until the time of Nathan Phillips, had to be A, an Orangeman, and B, supported by the telegram?
Not necessarily. There were exceptions. But in the main, it was true that they were Orangemen and that they were supported by the telegram. But it was not a condition precedent to their election. Sam McBride had a long-standing feud with the telegram. Sam McBride once barred telegram reporters from the mayor's office. And the telegram answered by refusing to mention Mr. McBride's name in the columns of the telegram.
How did they manage that?
Just by referring to him as the mayor. And I have seen Sam McBride mad on many occasions, but I have never seen him as mad as when the telegram refused to mention him as Mayor McBride.
Well, I remember one of my favorite characters in our business was Howard Rutsey, who I worked with on the police beat, but at one stage, years and years ago, he used to cover City Hall. He was a great friend of Sam McBride's, who was then mayor. Howard, at one stage, was assigned by the telly to do an obituary on the mayor because we always like to have these obituaries ready. This meant that Howard missed a council meeting, but later on, when he and Sam were having a drink, and after Howard had finished the obit, Sam allowed that he had missed Howard at the council meeting, and Howard had missed a lot of important things. Wondered what Howard was doing. Howard said, "You'll never believe this, Sam," but he said, "I was writing your obituary." And he explained to him why this happens. They had several more drinks, and at the mayor's insistence, Howard showed Sam McBride his own obituary. I remember Howard telling me that Sam started to cry, and he said, "Howard, you've got to run this thing. These are the nicest things that anybody has ever said about me." Howard said, "I'm sorry, Sam, you're going to have to wait to see it until you die."
Major Wemp was one of our top men, and he occupied a very prominent spot on the city desk. And he was also a controller, and he finally decided that he would run for mayor, which he did, and at that time, the opposition was Sam McBride. Now, Major Wemp was rather a small man, and Sam McBride was a big man, and this battle went on and on and on. Finally, the day came when it was getting very close to election, and at one of the meetings, Sam McBride apparently had said, referred to Wemp as a coward. So the telegram came out the next day with a beautiful long picture of Major Wemp standing there with all his medals and said, "This is the man McBride called a coward." And a few days later, Major Wemp was elected mayor of Toronto.
Early in the 1930s, when the airship R-100 flew over the city, the opposition Daily Star overtook the telegram in circulation and advertising lineage. The Star was young, aggressive, sensational, and the telegram was in the doldrums. Throughout the Depression, it kept its loyal city readers and continued to elect mayors, but the Star captured the suburbs and spread out across Ontario. Under the Robertson will, the telegram had become a trusteeship, with profits going to Robertson's favorite charity, the Hospital for Sick Children. Black Jack Robinson was dead, and in the telegram newsroom at Bay and Melinda Streets, calm prevailed. The new editorial bosses, C.O. Knowles, a golfer, and Jerry Snyder, a yachtsman, kept the paper just ticking over. The sick children were nursed back to health, while the paper sickened. Toronto was changing its tune, but not the telegram. It remembered the past every November the 11th, and on most other days, too.
In the 30s, it ran down. It was, I think, almost deliberately run down. They, for whatever reasons they might have had in mind, I remember a quote given to one of the city editors by one of the trustees, Snyder, the famous Jerry Snyder. So this reporter, or editor rather, went in to see Jerry Snyder and asked him what he thought of the possibilities of the employees buying the paper, and Snyder looked at him and he said, "Don't you realize that this chicken has been plucked?" Now, I don't think it had been plucked in any nefarious sense. There was nothing criminal about it, but it had been allowed to run down. They had lost all initiative, any interest in combating the Star. The Star at that stage of the game went by us like a runaway horse. And they were getting old, and they were secure. I think they suffered from fatty degeneration of the imagination at this period of the game.
Mr. Snyder was a hard man to work for. He was very demanding. But underneath all this, I think he was a very sweet old man. He was frightening. I remember once he was very demanding, and I did the Ukrainian beat for a while, quite a while. And he was very fond of Ukrainians, and they sort of adored him. This day I had been to something, and the president of the association had one of those tongue-twisting names. So I asked him to spell it out, so he wrote it in my pad, printed it. I came back and I thought, now I wonder if he's trying to cross me up. So I checked in the phone book in the city directory and put it in my story. So the next day, took my story down in fear and trembling, and Mr. Snyder read it through, and he said, "George, this is a terrific story you've done, but you spelt so-and-so's name wrong." I said, "Well, sir, he spelled it that way. City directory spells it that way, and the telephone book spells it that way." And he says, "Yes, George, but the telegram doesn't spell it that way."
Did you ever find out why this great interest in Ukrainians?
No, I never did.
You know, you'd be out in a job and there'd be 15 Star people with you the only one there. It was hard. It was tough, but it was great fun. I did the quints, you know, the Dion quints right from birth. It was a toughie to do, you see, because the Star had them sewn up and pretty well. So, you know, you were just on the outside coming in. But I had a lot of fun with that. I think some attachment to the whole family, really. Had a lot of tragedy in their story, a lot of heartbreaks.
You were asking me about strange characters we had in the old days. We had one whose name escapes me at the moment, but he had a strange hobby. He used to lurk in the shadows outside the King Edward Hotel, front entrance, and wait until some attractive girl by herself started in through the swinging doors, and then he would leap into the same compartment of the doors with her, revolve it very rapidly, kissing her all the way around, and gather extra speed, and she'd go flying into the lobby while he went flying in the other direction down the street. He'd go through the alley to the old telegram building on Melinda and Bay, and up into the city room, and he'd be sitting there looking very innocent when the police radio started blaring out to the cops were after on another Mad Masher case, you see.
An eccentric Toronto lawyer, millionaire lawyer, James Vance Miller. He left $1 million to be divided between a number of mothers who would bear the greatest number of children in a 9-year period between 1935 and 1944. Well, you can just imagine what went on then. The Telegram lined up their candidates for exclusive stories, and we had all sorts of day-to-day life and so on. Most intimate details of Derby life from some of these women. Of course, they were getting paid for it, as well as hoping they'd get the majority of the Miller will money. Anyway, the $1 million was finally spent, I think. We all feel that the lawyers in litigation got most of it.
With the outbreak of World War II, of course, the Athenia was sunk with a great loss of life, particularly a lot of people from Toronto. It's a ghastly story to cover, because a number of times I had to tell people, relatives here, that their people were gone. We had them on lists before they did. It was utter confusion. But there's a little story that sometime after that, Andrew Allen of the CBC, his father was lost in the Athenia, and Andrew survived. I had an appointment to see Andrew Allen at his apartment, or at an apartment, and on the corner nearby I met John Bassett, then a reporter for the Globe and Mail. This was just before he went into the Army. And boy, was he a handsome guy then. And he's, with this belted camel's hair coat and all this jazz. And he said, well, you're going to try and see Andrew Allen. Well, he's just not seeing anybody. So he waved airily, and I departed and walked around the block and went back and kept my appointed interview with Andrew Allen. John Bassett just loves that story.
We thought nothing of kidnapping. If a person won a few $100,000 in a sweepstake, our main objective was to get them away from the Star. We'd get to their homes as soon as we could, and maybe even have to almost push them out the door into our cars and get them the hell away from there. And then hide them, basically, until maybe the next day. And I think one kidnapping story I'll always remember was I was sent down to Port Hope to get aboard a train that was bringing the 100,000th immigrant into Toronto, who happened to be a Polish family. And we took along a Polish interpreter with us who I didn't realize until we'd traveled a considerable distance. She was yakking away in Polish, and I didn't know what was going on. But I asked her if she had approached this woman with the idea of getting her off the train, and oh no, they'd been talking about what was going on back in Poland. But however, in a very short period of time, we did talk the woman and her family into getting off at Oshawa, where we were met by a big cab that brought us into Toronto. At Toronto, we transferred them after having breakfast up on Bloor Street and contacting the office and sending in some pictures. We transferred them to our own cars and moved them out to Guelph. And later in the day, I met up with a Associated Screen, I think he was Associated Screen, it was Charlie Quick, who said, oh, Jack, he said, I was at the Union Station in Toronto, and he said, the mayor was there, the Salvation Army was there, the Red Cross was there, and he said, where was the 100,000th DP? He said, traveling around the country with that goddamn judges.
I've always told young kids who come around asking what they need to be a reporter is that they need good feet and a strong stomach. And I still think this is the case, because you spend so much of your time standing around, and you get into so many places where the smells are rather unsavory, or else you don't ever get a chance to eat, or if you do, you wish you hadn't. And royal tours are like that. You don't have time to eat, and you don't have time to sleep, and you certainly stand around a lot. But the first royal tour that took place here that I remember was in 1939. I can remember being downtown here in Toronto in front of the Royal York Hotel, and anyone who knows the city will know that that's a very wide street there with the Union Station on the other side, and it was an absolute solid mass of humanity, so solid that I was really frightened. I've never been frightened in a crowd before, and I'm sure that if anybody had wanted to scratch their nose, they couldn't have got their arm up to do it. It was that packed. This used to be a much smaller community, and it used to be very conscious, I think, of its British roots. And that feeling is gone too now.
One of the biggest stories that will ever break in Toronto, I think, is the day that the Noronic burned in Toronto Harbor. I was rather annoyed because I came into the office, I was called in, and the whole staff was there. It was turmoil. And they told me to go out to the horticultural building at the exhibition. And I thought, flowers at a time like this. Anyway, I grabbed a cab and went out. As I got to the horticultural building, one of our young reporters was coming out, and he was green. He said, George, you better not go in. And I said, well, I've got to go in. And it was in the horticultural building at the CNE that they were bringing the bits and pieces of the bodies. It wasn't a very pretty sight. And there were thousands and thousands of beautiful stories written, but so many of them were crowded out.
George McCullough, the flamboyant publisher of the Globe and Mail, breathed new life into the telegram when he bought it in 1948. He told the staff, "We're going to knock off the Star." And to do so, he brought in as general manager John Bassett, Jr., and the telly roared into action. McCullough died in 1952, and Bassett, backed by Eaton department store money, bought the paper for $4.25 million. He had a choice. He could keep the telegram going quietly as Toronto's third newspaper, or he could continue McCullough's war on the Star. Ex-Major Bassett chose war. And his field commander was the then city editor, ex-Major J. Douglas McFarland.
My motto was, as I sat on the city desk, if there was anybody in front of me when a big news story broke, there was something very wrong with him. He must have been nailed to his chair. And we had some exciting times, and this was reflected in the fact that during the first 10 months under McCullough's ownership, the telegram moved from a circulation of somewhere around the area of 185,000 to about 270,000. Now, all this gain wasn't wholly the result of the enterprise of the news department by any means. There were such lively little things as Match the Twins contests and various other promotions. But a good deal of it was because of the news department's aggressive attitude, and we rather caught the opposition, the Toronto Star, a bit off base. They were starting to move into the doldrums at that time. So we gained a bit of momentum, and we came on strong.
And the idea was to get to the scene of a story before they did and get all the available pictures. And that didn't mean going out with a camera. It meant going to the house and cajoling the people into parting with pictures. And you were not satisfied with one picture, which might be a good likeness of the victim. It was usually a victim. You cleaned out everything. Old snapshot albums with baby pictures and class pictures hanging on the wall and everything else. And if you came back without that, your city editor was likely to be pretty enraged. You haven't done half a job.
Oh, these were great days. There was the Neuronic, there was Hurricane Hazel, there was the Marilyn Bell Swim, there was Fabian of the Yard, one of the greatest newspaper promotions in Canada I've ever been associated with. And the Fabian deal all came from several lads sitting around the rewrite desk on
Ian Patterson.
Ian Patterson, George Vermel, and a rather dull afternoon, and trading lies and thinking up terrible things to do. And somebody said, well, why don't we get Fabian? He was reading this paperback and said, why don't we get Fabian of the Yard over to solve this crime, which happened to be the McDowell case where a young girl had been murdered. Fabian did attack the crime conscientiously and with a good deal of expertise and imagination, but he never really did solve it. He told us that he had solved it, but he couldn't prove it. But just about the time when we didn't know where to go, and we had picked up 27,000 readers in the summertime, which was unheard of in Toronto journalism, newspapers. And we didn't know where to move because he just had come to the end, really. Marilyn Bell swam Lake Ontario and took us right off the hook, and everybody forgot about Robert Fabian and the promotion and turned their attention to this wonderful little girl who had conquered Lake Ontario, and that is a story in itself.
Listen to me while I try to tell the stirring story of Miss Marilyn Bell. One fine summer day in '54, she swam across the lake to the Ontario shore. Marilyn, everybody's sweetheart, Marilyn, worship from afar, Marilyn, everybody's sweetheart, but the special property of the Toronto Star. The Star had everybody writing quotes. Then the telly joined the battle with a fleet of boats. By mid-afternoon, it was hard to tell who had the ding-dong and who had Belle.
You see, the star had the girl, and the best way I had of competing was what is now called probably overreacting, but was just to blanket the story, take over the story, and make everybody feel that it really is ours. It's not theirs. Well, in line with this, I figured that if we could get every reporter that was anywhere involved in the swim, they would contribute whatever they had heard Marilyn say yesterday or today or at any time during the swim to Dorothy Howard, who would do an overall first-person story, but we had to do something to make it reasonably authentic. So I remember sending Mad Sale up to Loretta College, where Marilyn had attended. I figured somewhere along the line they must have had her signature. And he found it and photographed it, and we brought it back, and we didn't say by Marilyn Bell on the article. We just ran her signature, Marilyn Bell, and then with Marilyn's own story. And of course, it was just a wow. In the meantime, the Star was so exhausted in protecting her that nobody got around to writing the real story that they paid a lot of money for.
Well, it wasn't quite ethical, but then, you know. So everybody funneled in and brought in all the information they had and what they had heard to my desk, so that we wrote the story. The Star, in the meantime, had taken her to the Royal York Hotel and bedded her down, and she was so exhausted that she immediately fell asleep. And the reporters sort of just didn't want to wake her up. They thought, isn't this terrible, this poor child? We can't wake her up and talk to her and interview her and take her picture when she's feeling the way she is, and look at what she's done. So personally, you know, they had no personal interview with Marilyn. Their paper came out without a personal interview, and it looked as if we were the ones who had, and we had the picture. That's right, didn't we? Who was it that took that picture?
Ted Dinsmore.
Ted Dinsmore on the, as she touched the breakwater? That's right. So that we had the scoop, and they had Marilyn. And that's how it worked out.
10, 15 years ago, I guess the telegram was a great sort of, we went through our stunt phase, where we got involved in every sort of curious aspect of journalism, from people washing elephants to swinging on trapezes and things. And I suppose everybody who has been here a certain length of time has his own sort of stories in this area. I think probably the most exotic story I got involved in, or stunt, or whatever one wants to call it, before we had the slogan, "The Telegram Cares," was the Telly milk ship, which was replete with, well, near disasters and anecdotes and all sorts of funny things. I was called in one day by the city editor and said, Worthington, you've seen a lot of hungry kids, you write about milk, which meant writing an article a day about milk for something like 95 days, which really taxes the imagination. I wrote these articles, and always at the end would put in, your dime will feed 343 children, keep them alive. My deal with this then, of course, was to fly ahead to the various spots when the milk ship arrived and write stories about grateful children drinking this bounty from Canada. We arrived in Naples, it was a blinding rainstorm when the Telly ship came in. And we had the Canadian ambassador out there, all the dignitaries, under a canopy, which I watched from afar, gradually filling with water. And it was a very exciting moment, seeing all the ceremonies going on, and an orphanage band, which immediately scattered in the midst of old Canada while playing due to the rain. But this canopy filled with water and finally exploded over everybody. And it was just a splendid sight. I tried to get this in the story. It was edited out by more serious editors. The only other thing in Naples is that somehow a bag of white paint powder got mixed up with the Canadian milk. And of course, 8 orphans died from it, which the communist press immediately saw as a sinister manipulation by the telegram to reduce the population explosion of Italy.
I said to Petlock, if you're such a hell of a hot police reporter, why don't you go out and capture the Strangler? And he said, how would I do that? And I said, well, you could dress up as a woman and parade up and down the streets till you were attacked. And I said, okay, if you're afraid to do it, I'll do it. And 12 o'clock when I was off duty, we all got together and made me up and took me out to the area where the Strangler had been operational. Because we began to take this thing kind of seriously, we parked cars all along this street with people in them who would come to my rescue if and when I was attacked. Well, we went down this street. I got off at Dundas and started to walk down towards Queen. And I'd almost reached the end of the street, and I'd passed all my buddies in their cars, and they'd given me the wink as we went by. And nothing happened. And the next thing I knew, somebody landed on my back. So I started to struggle with him. And fortunately for me, he was a little guy also, and not any bigger than I was. And we stumbled over the curb or something like that. And of course, my wig came off, and my voice had been a dead giveaway anyway. And I said, take it easy, you know, this is all a gag. And he was, I think, considering the circumstances, a pretty brave guy if I had really been what he suspected I was. He thought I was the Strangler. All of a sudden, 3 cars just came in, converging in, one of which turned out to be a police cruiser. And they grabbed the guy, and Ray McFadden took a picture of him. And I was kind of lucky because this guy had a girl in his car, as it turned out. And because I'd been successful in dragging the guy towards the street, she got into the fray. And just as I was released when the cars all came up, I could see her claws just getting ready to rake me. So I was quite fortunate.
Andy, what were you doing selling pencils?
Well, there'd been some kind of an outcry in the press about someone observing that I think a welfare recipient who also sold pencils was arriving at his pencil-selling pitch in a taxi cab or leaving in one. So, you know, very simple. We wanted to find out how much money you made selling pencils. So I sold pencils for a while and made just a little bit more than I was then making as a reporter per hour.
Well, it was the Shriners Circus, and we wanted to do a story about the circus, and they decided we should cover it from the inside. You know, the poor man's answer to George Plimpton. So I got into some spangly tights, and I remember I rode an elephant around the ring, which was fun. And then I was in the lion's cage. And, you know, we got in the cage, and you put your hand in his mouth, and the poor old lion, you know, he had hardly any teeth, and he was sitting there. I felt sorry for the lion. He was about as dangerous as my cat at home. And in any case, I'm fond of animals and wasn't frightened of him. And I balked at the final, though. They wanted to shoot me out of the cannon. And I said, no. That was it.
My wife and I were dressed in Mormon costumes and sent out to live a week in Pioneer Village in the style of people 150 years ago. You know, grinding your own corn, making candles, gathering herbs from the garden, killing pigs, being midwife to a bunch of sheep. All the cattle were pregnant at Pioneer Village. And it didn't seem to bother anybody except me, and they all began to foal or pup or whatever they do. Cooking out of old pots which had creosol or something preservative in it, which gave everything a taste of something foul. But we had a chicken. We took a chicken out there which we named Gladys from Kensington Market. And Gladys became sort of a principle of the stories. And when we finally killed Gladys and ate her, there was tremendous indignation. There was almost a minor Save Gladys fund started. But I was surprised at how much anguish for this wretched chicken.
Well, the Munsinger story was the wildest I ever covered. I was based in London and called to Munich, and more or less when I got there, I became a field editor because...
This was after the Toronto Star had established that Gerda Munsinger, featured in this parliamentary scandal,
that's right,
was alive and not dead, as the RCMP
I don't know why you have to
said.
bring that up, Gordon, but that's right, they did. And they had her locked up in an apartment. We couldn't get at her. So we sat around in the hallways for days, so she couldn't get out. If we couldn't get in, she couldn't get out. Telegram flew in, a friend of Gerda Munsinger's from Montreal. I think her name was Jackie Delorme. And I stuck her in a room way up at the top of the hotel and told her, gave her orders to talk to no one because the Star was also living in the hotel. And the plot was that we would arrange for Jackie to meet Gerda without the agent knowing that Jackie was in our back pocket. And one day the agent did come along with a car and picked Jackie up and took her away, but he blindfolded her so she didn't know where she was going. And we waited back at the hotel until she came back because we were starving for wordage at this point. Had to keep the story alive. And she arrived back and promptly burst into tears. So there was nothing but water all over our notebooks. We didn't have a word down at this stage of the games. Finally, we wound up after a half-an-hour conversation with her with this total intelligence that they had a very good cry. And that's all we got out of her after all that expense.
For a period, operated as if we had the resources of the Associated Press all at our beck and call. During the 6-day war, we had 3 people. We had one, for instance. So I think an example of that time in our lives was when we had Worthington in Cairo. We had Slonim and Devitt in Israel. We hired our stringer in Israel, put him on full time, so that was 3. We had Aaron in Moscow, and I think Art Cole in the United Nations. But we operated this whole group of people as if we were a news service. You know, that's an extraordinary expense for one little newspaper to undertake. Nobody does that, but that was the sort of thing we were doing then. Did it do our circulation any good? We stayed in business, and I think we did convince a lot of people that we were a good newspaper. Well, certainly we were. I don't know if we convinced anybody. I don't know what, if I knew what did circulation a lot of good, I guess we would have done it.
The telegram was a curious combination of the irreverent and attempts to be the serious. I think during all this time and beyond, the telegram was probably the one newspaper in Canada which took an active or direct interest in foreign affairs as they related to crises. We became the great crises-covering newspapers, which is sort of the fire brigade aspect of journalism. And this is sending people out to cover a particular crisis when it hits the headlines, rather than keeping resident correspondence, which is something I think is valid and necessary for Canadian newspapers, since we haven't the circulations to maintain full-time bureaus in all the places where civil wars occurred. It's been an accepted bromide that you have a bureau man on the spot, knowing the area, and he's on top of everything. You get a more profound, deep interpretation, that this has advantages over the other one, which I suppose in abstract it does have. But your fire brigade person, or the person who goes into a crisis, stays a month, 3 weeks, or whatever, and then comes out. Also, it gives you more liberty to write. You don't have to live there. You write your stories, you come out, write a series of what you really think. And that's that. By the time you come back for the next crisis, your old contacts are hanging on lampposts, partly perhaps due to your story about them the first time.
Our latest, I guess, phase of our development was that we changed our format a year or so ago. We thought, in a way that would both meet the criticisms and the needs of people in this kind of a market for a newspaper. And I guess everybody keeps saying to you, we were quite successful. The successful operation in which the patient died, but the format we now have, which grew out of that period, is a good one. And we divided the news and the opinion into separate sections of the paper. We reinforced both at the same time. We instituted a public service section, which, its anchor was Action Line, but...
The Telegram Cares.
Yeah, well...
Was that a successful attitude?
I judge that you don't feel that was a very good slogan, and possibly you're right. I would defend it on the grounds that we're now just into the area of advertising the product. There are the two approaches to any product. There's this kind of rational numbers approach, which is only available to the guy who is selling the most widgets or whatever it happens to be, or you can say that there are subjective qualities connected with our product that are important to you, in addition to exclusive of the fact that the other guy may be selling more of them. Ours will do more for you.
Well, in a newspaper, that's kind of difficult because you can't say, with any credibility, when two products were so evenly matched as those two, you can't say we got more news in ours, or if the dam breaks, you won't read about it in the opposition, because that's not true. So anyway, the CARES thing was an effort to sum up what a lot of people do feel about a newspaper, is that it has to be more and more involved with people as individuals. So the telegram CARES, sure, you can say it's a kind of a soppy sentiment and probably didn't sell any newspapers. On the other hand, that kind of reasoning was behind it. It wasn't just, we didn't snap our fingers and say, well, let's see if Caring will sell some papers.
This was a pioneer effort with the telegram. Other papers have copied it since, but we were the first, and some other papers have not kept it going. But we've had really amazing success with this type of presentation. For instance, this family, 6 children. You can see probably that they're all blonde and extremely attractive. Well, they appeared in the paper, and when I wrote about them, I referred to this picture, which was taken by our veteran photographer, Mad Sale, as a human totem pole. And over 50 people wrote wanting to adopt these children. And that is really remarkable. We have used, in the 7 years this series has been running, we have used pictures of over 2,000 children, and about 75% of them have been adopted.
Well, who's going to carry on this work now, the telegrams, Dad?
This I don't know, and this is a matter of great concern to me because I've become very much involved in it.
If what we were trying to do was to make money, what we should have done is practically none of the things we did do. But that isn't what he was trying to do. So you have to begin, I mean, I don't know, you can ask Bassett, but having worked for him for about 15 years, I would say that the last thing he was ever interested in was the first thing Thompson's interested in, the balance sheet. For instance, one of the things you're often told about trying to sell something is that the thing should be clearly identifiable. It should have one monolithic personality. For instance, a newspaper, you should be able to tell exactly. Now, that's not very good journalism in Bassett's terms, because what he did was sort of institutionalized anarchy. You know, you got Lubor fulminating away over here about whatever's on his mind. You got Douglas Fisher saying Lubor's nuts over here, and you got Bassett saying they're both crazy. All of them articulate, valid viewpoints. All of them on the same paper on the same day, and a whole lot of readers at least saying, my goodness, what is this paper for? Well, what the paper was for was that. It isn't all that easy to explain. We had a shot at it for quite a while. The paper was very much an expression of his personality, but the essential part of the personality that was being expressed, or one of the essentials, was this belief in a wide variety of opinions. So that very frequently, when I did go to the odd editorial meeting before I found a way not to, he would say quite plaintively, can't I get one damn thing that I think into my newspaper, you know? From time to time, Bassett, as all publishers do, used to summon us all and when some disaster had occurred, and in a little kind of parade of penitential executives, and one day we all arrived for our dressing down and found him walking up and down on the 2 evening newspapers, his and the Star, and he stamped on the headline of the Star with his heel, and he said, that kind of a story in this newspaper, gentlemen, the Toronto Daily Star, A, isn't in the newspaper I have the misfortune to own this one, the Telegram, and B, is one of the reasons why this newspaper in enterprise and general all-around good journalism is just knocking the spots off this thing, and at which point I piped up in the background, we had that story in our newspaper on Saturday. And he stopped and without drawing breath smiled and said, happiness, gentlemen, is when the publisher is full of bull. End of meeting.
I don't think that the newspapers, either one of them, were as much fun reading as they were some time ago. And I think that they really take themselves too seriously. That is one of my criticisms of the press today, that, God, there's an awful lot of joie de vivre still around. and more emphasis should be placed on that aspect of news coverage. There are times when you can go through the metropolitan newspapers, and very, very sizable ones they are too, with 64 pages and that sort of thing. And about the only laugh you might get is from having a chuckle over Mackenzie Porter, or Paul Rimstead, or Gary Lottens, or something like that. The rest of it is oh so serious and oh so deadly sometimes. Despite the ups and downs and rounds and abouts, certainly the paper appealed to a lot of people. And to me, of course, I hardly need say, it's just, I can't say how badly I feel about the death of the telegram. You can replace, obviously, a lot of material things, but a newspaper, a metropolitan newspaper this day and age, a great institution, is just irreplaceable.
Do you think those 250,000 families have been bought up lock, stock, and barrel by the Star for $10 million? Are they going to buy the Star?
Well, whether they'll buy the Star or not, the Star's attempted to buy them. The facts are there, they're obvious. There are some telegram readers that will not probably ever again, or just spasmodically anyway, read an afternoon paper.
But although the paper's changed, this is a puzzling thing, although the paper's changed tremendously between the three different owners that have had it since John Ross Robertson died. The trustees ran it, then McCullough bought it, then Mr. Bassett bought it. It's changed almost completely. And yet the old lady in Scarborough still thinks it's the old telegram from John Ross Robertson's day. And she's very faithful to it. And I think genuinely grieving that it's going.
The telegram died a lingering death in the 6 weeks from the time Bassett threw in the towel until the presses stopped. Most newspaper deaths are instantaneous, and it said a lot for the professionalism of the 200 journalists and the others that most of them worked on to the end. There was sadness and some bitterness, but the telly went out with dignity. Mr. Bassett said he couldn't keep going because the paper was losing $1 million a year. He said, "I'm sorry I couldn't do better." As the weeks went by, it transpired that financially at least he'd done quite well. The Star bought up the apparently worthless subscription list for $10 million, and to make doubly sure the telly stayed dead, leased its presses for 2 years. The Globe bought the plant for something between $7 and $12 million. It all dovetailed nicely. The Star needs the facilities now, the Globe will need them in 2 years. The Globe also picked up the weekend magazine supplement from the Telegram, thus ensuring it would continue to publish and be distributed by the other members of the Globe's parent group, FB Publications. And it closed down its own expensive weekly magazine. Another death. It seems everyone made a dollar except the public. Telegram executives and some staff members say the American Newspaper Guild killed the paper by taking a strike vote, thus pushing Bassett over the cliff. Others say he was planning to jump months before. At no time has he publicly blamed the union. Big John, an outspoken, loud character, has been very quiet these weeks. Bereavement, he wrote in his last editorial, is essentially a private matter. Whatever the immediate cause, the death of the Telegram had been predicted for years. Toronto was the last city in Canada with 3 independently owned newspapers, one of very few cities in North America. So it seemed one had to go. And yet this week a new paper began, the Toronto Sun, a morning tabloid run by 60 former telly people. Why?
The Toronto Sun is something different than has ever been tried in Toronto before on a daily basis. We're tabloid, we're going to be brief, we're going to be entertaining, we're going to be outspoken, we're going to present a view that some people might disagree with, but they will at least know what the view is. It's not going to be wishy-washy. We're Toronto-oriented, community-oriented, and we're just going to try and find a market for ourselves in between the Globe and the Star. A bunch of us decided we'd have one more look before we all dispersed to our other public relations jobs or something, and at the time we were having a look, some people came along, unlike us, who had money, and wondered if this situation was a viable thing economically.
Who are these people, and why should a newspaper be viable if the telegram wasn't?
The problem about not identifying some of these people has been that rumors, which I can deny now and will most likely persist despite my denial, that Mr. Bassett is actually secretly behind this. It's not true. There is no Bassett money of any kind involved in this paper. We've also been accused of being a front for various developers. The Cadillacs, the Greenwinds, the Meridians are not involved financially in it. It's a group of individuals with ample backing to keep us going as long as we feel that it's worth going, and we feel that we'll catch on immediately. I think it's viable when the telly isn't because the situation is quite unique in Toronto at this stage. There are advertising dollars available. There is a circulation available caused by the demise of the telegram, and there was a first-rate staff available. And I'm guessing here, but I would think that over 90% of the people working for the Sun are doing so having turned down other jobs. I think a good percentage of them are most likely doing so having turned down other jobs at more money.
Are they being well paid?
They're being paid as well as... I don't think newspaper men are very well paid, period.
Ill-paid or not, the telly people had their triumphs. Some recorded on metal plaques, others wrapping the next day's garbage. Years of work and skill went into the telegram, and a lot of emotion. The individual effort was there, so where did the newspaper go wrong?
Well, I don't know as it's a matter of doing anything wrong. I've been thinking about it because the newspaper comes into your house almost like a friend, you know, something you depend on, and it has a personality, an individuality, as if someone walks in the door that you've known for a long time. And perhaps if it had retained some sort of solid identity so that you knew it was this old friend and that it would never change, perhaps it wouldn't be changed now.
You see, I think we made the mistake of trying to build up our weaknesses instead of exploiting our strengths. I think the telegram should have gone after the appeal to the kind of reader that you'd think a moderate conservative newspaper would appeal to. I don't think we did. We had the chance, if ever a country was tailor-made for a voice of moderation and sanity, it's Canada today, and the telegram should have been the one attacking as an opposition paper. I think we let the chance slide.
So I regard as one of the real triumphs of the telegram was that we did indeed build up a staff in a very short space of time with a loyalty to the paper unexcelled to my knowledge, with a morale that was just first class, and a camaraderie. These people operated as if they were absolutely dedicated to the paper and dedicated to its success, and had a personal equity in the paper. The paper was theirs. They didn't just work for the paper. The paper, they were the telegram, and the telegram was theirs. And of course, this is one of the very sad things about the loss of the telegram, and one of the aspects to the paper that was always the envy of people who worked for the Star.
But somehow something has died that was that we all thought would carry on as a sort of a heritage. I suppose it's just like the last member of a wonderful family dying out, because the telegram stood for so many things that were good. We've had great fun together. We shed a few tears together, and I don't think I've ever been closer to tears than I have many times in the last few weeks.